Throughout the history of horror films, there have been numerous so-called slashers. A single killer, or as was the case in 1996's Scream and 2008's Strangers, numerous killers, who cause havoc and carnage throughout the course of their rampage, rarely leaving more than a scant few, if not just one, protagonist alive by the film's end. What sets each slasher apart, and what arguably drives some into the spotlight of being considered a horror icon, is their motivations. Michael Myers is considered the great white shark of slashers, in that he seems to kill out of little more than a predatory instinct and love of the game. Freddy Krueger kills out of vengeance, an all-consuming desire for payback on those who took justice into their own hands and ended his life after the courts failed to convict him of his mortal crimes. But for one slasher, the motivation seems less focused on personal enjoyment, and more a solemn sense of duty, or even love. It's this that sets Jason Voorhees apart as a unique, but no less threatening horror character. However, as later films seem to focus less and less on Jason's motivations and more on killing for killing's sake, they lose what makes Jason unique, and thus he seems to melt into the faceless crowd of dime a dozen slasher antagonists. In Friday the 13th Part 1, Jason is presumed dead, and only appears in the form of a child, both as a flashback and a hallucination towards the end of the film. Instead, the killer of this film is Jason's mother, Pamela, identified in the film only as Mrs. Voorhees. Pamela is seeking vengeance on the camp counselors whom she believed murdered her son through their neglect. She believes they were off having sex instead of watching Jason as they should have been, which resulted in Jason drowning in Crystal Lake in 1957. She seems to have suffered a psychotic break, believing Jason is talking to her, though interestingly, both the two-part comic Pamela's Tale and the Friday the 13th video game either imply or outright state that Pamela began hearing Jason's voice while pregnant with him, which could suggest the psychosis is either prepartum or traumatic in origin. Whatever the case, Camp Crystal Lake is closed after Pamela's initial double homicide in 1958, with the true perpetrator never brought to justice. Pamela then embarks on a crusade to try and keep the camp closed for good, engaging in acts of vandalism such as setting fires and putting arsenic in the camp's water supply. When, in 1979, the camp looks set to open again, Pamela goes on her deadliest rampage, slaughtering all but one of the counselors while urged on by hallucinations of Jason, until she's finally decapitated by Alice Hardy, the sole survivor. In short, what this film sets up is not only Jason's origins, but his motivations too. Friday the 13th Part 2 initially picks up shortly after Part 1, and for the first time Jason appears as a grown man, having seemingly survived his drowning at Crystal Lake decades earlier, and having witnessed his mother's death. Jason tracks down and murders Alice with an ice pick as vengeance for the death of his mother, before taking up his mother's cause, keeping the camp and surrounding areas clear and free of people. To this end, Jason goes to a school for camp counselors not far from Camp Crystal Lake, intent on killing all he finds within. The film's protagonist, Ginny Fields, is an aspiring child psychologist, and while ruminating on Jason's story, she gives what is perhaps the best explanation of Jason's motivations in the entire film series. Quote, "He'd be grown by now, right? And you know the only person who ever knew him was his mother. He never went to school, so he never had any friends. I mean, she was everything to him. I doubt Jason would have known the meaning of death, or at least until that horrible night. He must have seen the whole thing happen. He must have seen his mother get killed. And all just because she loved him. Isn't that what her revenge was all about? Her sense of loss, her rage at what she thought happened, her love for him? He must be out there right now, crying for her return, her resurrection." Unquote. That speech established almost exactly what Jason's motivations were. Vengeance for his deceased mother, keeping the area clear of intruders, and, perhaps as evidenced by his shrine to Pamela, consisting of her severed head, sweater and pants, some misguided attempt to bring her back. In the confrontation between Ginny and Jason's shack, one can see he has placed bodies at the foot of the shrine, as if an offering, specifically those of Alice Hardy, Terry and Deputy Winslow. This seems to imply that Jason might believe Pamela could return to him when her work is finally done. Ginny takes advantage of this belief by donning Pamela's sweater and assuming the role of her to force Jason into submission, a trick which Jason seems to believe at first, only realising the truth of the deception when he catches sight of Pamela's head on the shrine behind Ginny, still very much dead. Similarly, in Friday the 13th the game, Jason is driven by the disembodied voice of his mother, much like Pamela was driven by Jason's voice in Part 1. Pamela's voice encourages Jason to kill as many counselors as possible, and will praise or comfort him based upon his success. This is a direct parallel to Pamela hearing Jason's voice in the first film, and if considered canon, lends considerable weight to his reasons for killing. Friday the 13th parts 3 and 4 only reference Pamela indirectly, with 3 featuring a hallucination of her capsizing the final girl's canoe, in parallel to a hallucination of Jason from part 1, and part 4 showing a brief shot of her headstone in a run-down roadside graveyard. While they don't discuss the dynamic between Pamela and Jason as explicitly as part 1 and 2 do, these moments are to anchor us in the timeline and remind us of Pamela's dominant presence within the story. Part 5 takes an indirect but infinitely more significant path to reinforce the story of Jason and Pamela as the overarching theme of the series. In it, a seemingly resurrected Jason begins his killing spree once again, this time at a halfway home located near Crystal Lake. But the end of the film reveals something interesting. The killer was never Jason at all, but a copycat, a paramedic named Roy Burns. Roy began his spree after being called to remove a body from the halfway house, only to discover it was his own estranged son, Joey, murdered by a patient with anger issues. Roy assumes the identity of Jason in order to exact revenge on those he deemed responsible for his son's death, which directly parallels Pamela's motivations. Once again, this is a story of a grief-stricken and unstable parent, avenging their dead son by killing those who had been entrusted with his care, but had failed to save him from an untimely fate. Friday the 13th, Part 6, Jason Lives, deals with Jason's Frankenstein-esque, scientifically questionable, and lightning-based resurrection and subsequent undead antics. Part 7, A New Blood, pits Jason against a telekinetic girl who closely resembles, and indeed was based upon, according to associate producer Barbara Sachs, Stephen King's Carrie. While both interesting films in their own right, neither make mention or pay homage to Pamela, which leaves both feeling a little lost in translation with the relevant context as to why. Why is this newly undead Jason so dead set against people living around his lake? Could it be some sort of zombie instinct, or shame for his newly undead visage? Or could it be that his mother, that driving force behind his life, is still driving him to kill in her name? Part 8, Jason Takes Manhattan, is perhaps the best example of the series having lost its way. After killing 2 lovers aboard a houseboat on Crystal Lake, Jason sneaks aboard a large cruise ship, seemingly intent on killing everyone aboard. After some of the group escape, Jason pursues them all the way into New York City. But up until now, Jason's sole purpose has been to kill those who ventured too close to Crystal Lake. So again, the question is, why? Why this boat, this particular group of people? Why follow them so far? If Final Girl Rennie's visions of Jason as a child, apparently due to a latent empathetic abilities and a previous encounter with Jason at Crystal Lake, are the answer, then that only brings more questions. How does Jason even know, and why does he care? Without a clear motive for killing, the film seems to confuse fans who care about this thing more than it entertains. Jason Goes to Hell for Final Friday is perhaps the worst-liked film of the franchise. Through a bizarre and at times nonsensical plot, it tries to tie the Friday continuity to the Evil Dead franchise, but with some massive oversights that leave it a garbled mess of half-baked lore. Filmmaker Adam Marcus said, quote, "Pamela Voorhees makes a deal with the devil by reading from the Necronomicon to bring back her son. This is why Jason isn't Jason. He's Jason plus the Evil Dead, and now I can believe he can go from a little boy that lives in a lake to a full-grown man in a couple of months to zombie Jason, and never being able to kill this guy," unquote. But that in itself raises so much confusion. If Jason truly is a Deadite, why does he not seem to possess their canonical abilities of levitation, shape-shifting, or super speed? Why does he not have the blank white eyes or their heavily exaggerated mutations? His appearances in parts 2 through to 4, while clearly deformed, are not nearly as horrific nor as exaggerated as the Deadites. So if this is an attempt to retroactively add this fact into lore, it just doesn't work. And not to mention the fact that Pamela, while a deranged murderer, would surely not be so cruel as to resurrect her beloved son as an undead monster. What parent would want that for their child? Jason X sees Jason go to space, after being cryogenically frozen in an underground research facility, and then revived 445 years later aboard the spaceship Grendel. It's as bizarre and steeped in sci-fi campiness as it sounds, but objectively more fun than its immediate predecessors. Pamela is not featured or even mentioned in this film at all, but she was to be. The writers at one point wished to have her appear during the scene where Jason is distracted by a holographic projection of Crystal Lake. One idea was to even have Jason attack the hologram of his mother, to show just how evil he had become. This idea was eventually discarded, and Jason X became another in a long line of Friday films that seem to forget the franchise's origins. Freddy vs. Jason, the long-awaited crossover between Friday and the Nightmare on Elm Street series, finally seemed to remember who Jason was. Freddy hatches a plan to make the children of Elm Street remember him, as with no memory of him and thus no fear of him, he has no power. To this end, Freddy poses as Pamela, awakening the seemingly dead Jason, and as Pamela he instructs Jason to go to Elm Street to punish the naughty children. Jason, driven as ever by his mother's instructions, proceeds to do just that, until he takes it too far, snatching victims right out from under Freddy's nose. Enraged, Freddy takes possession of a victim to tranquilize Jason, and poses as Pamela again to chastise him for going too far. Freddy then reveals a deception to Jason, that it was never Pamela but him who had ordered Jason to go to Elm Street. This knowledge enrages Jason, who proceeds to fight Freddy, hindered by his fear of water and memories of his tragic childhood, both of which Freddy preys upon to weaken Jason. The teenage protagonists drive the unconscious Jason back to Crystal Lake, hoping that it might give him a home field advantage over Freddy. At the conclusion of the film, Jason has survived his encounter with the Dream Demon and, back at Crystal Lake, seemingly returns to his old life of prowling the woods, continuing his mother's work. By the time the gritty 2000s reboot rolled around, the series had fallen into obscurity, and in the spirit of that decade's Texas Chainsaw and Halloween remakes, the Friday the 13th series was reset, with a new Jason and a new Pamela Voorhees. The film stayed relatively close to what had come before in terms of backstory, presenting a condensed version of events, the opening credits showing Pamela's rampage, her confession, and murder in quick succession. It then leaps straight to an adult Jason stalking and murdering campers, transitioning quickly from the sack mask, like the one worn in Part 2, to the iconic hockey mask the character is known for. It even includes Jason freezing at the sight of someone impersonating Pamela, the girl in question kidnapped and imprisoned by Jason earlier in the film due to the resemblance to Pamela. It feels like the remake is trying to have its cake and eat it too. The flashbacks only really carry weight to long-time viewers of the series, acting as a refresher of what came before, and skirting around the parts not as well known to the average viewer. Throughout the countless comics, novels and video games, with all their twists and additions to the canon, the bond between mother and son remains the same when it's remembered. The overarching tale of Pamela and Jason is one of love. Each were all the other had, until they were cruelly torn apart. What follows is a horrifying and seemingly unending spree of vengeance, as mother and then son exact bloody justice on those who dare trespass on their solitude. To deviate from the path is to turn away from what Jason is at his core, his mother's son. Let's hope if the series ever returns to our screens, they remember that core. Thanks for listening.